kind of like a wilderness. And he is on the east side of Galilee, and that's where he does, in fact, perform this miracle of feeding the 4,000, which had all kinds of significance to it. But the great significance that I want to impress upon us is the fact that this is, once again, it's a Gentile region where he is doing this work. And then, of course, he heads north from there, and he's still on the east side, what would be the east side of the Jordan River, even though the Jordan River actually begins at the Sea of Galilee. And he travels north to Caesarea Philippi. And it is at Caesarea Philippi where we see the great confession that Peter makes when Jesus is asking them the question about, who do men say that I am? And then he says, but who do you say that I am? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three record this. And Matthew is the one who does this in much greater detail than the other two gospel writers do. Now, I think it's of particular note that after Peter's confession, Jesus now indicates to his disciples for the first time what his future is. And you see this recorded in Matthew chapter 16. And again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all speak about this. But I want to note Matthew's account of this over in Matthew, the 16th chapter, beginning in verse 21, where after this confession has been made, verse 21 says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day raised. Now, that presents a question about what has transpired here, because everything has been building up to a crescendo. And now, with the confession of Peter, Jesus tells these men, he is finally fully transparent with them. And when they hear that, do you recall how, first of all, how Peter reacted, and then the rest of them for that matter? What was Peter's reaction to the fact that Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem, they're going to torture me, and eventually they're going to kill me, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead? Peter's remark. That's right. Peter said, Lord, this will not happen to you. In other words, he's not going to let it happen. And that's when Jesus then speaks what is a very dubious kind of statement to Peter, where he says, get behind me, Satan, for you're minding the things of men and not the things of God. So what that indicates is that they did not understand why he had come. They just have no clue about the purpose in Jesus coming to the earth. And Jesus is trying to help them to prepare them for what is ultimately going to happen and what is in actually the very near future. So again, there's a lot that happens during this time of his earthly ministry there in Galilee, but he is withdrawn from Galilee. He's gone into what are mainly Gentile regions, and I would suggest to you that there's a lesson right there in and of itself, and that is that Jesus just didn't come for Jews. He also came for the Gentiles in order to be able to make it possible for them to be in a right relationship with God. I think that that's something that we can glean from his departure from Galilee into these Gentile regions. But now he's ready to go into Judea. And that is what we're going to be picking up, where we're going to be picking up in his Judean ministry. Now let me make this observation, that by this time, Jesus had already predicted to his disciples twice, while he was in Galilee, what would happen to him once he arrived in Jerusalem. Actually, one was in Caesarea Philippi and the other one was in Galilee. He had predicted twice. The first time it's recorded is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, as we've read. The second time it's recorded is in Matthew chapter 17, verse 22, where it talks about that they were gathering in Galilee, and Jesus says to them, now for the second time, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. He will be raised on the third day, and they were greatly distressed. Now this time they don't say anything to him. They're just distressed because this is not a message that they want to hear. How do you believe, or what do you believe would have been the thought process of particularly these disciples, but mainly all of his disciples? How would they have perceived Jesus as he's come into this world and doing the great things that he's done, announcing the coming of the kingdom of God? How do you think that they were viewing this, in other words? What is he going to do? Okay, it's an earthly kingdom, so he's leading a revolution. And of course, Jesus was very radical in the things that he was teaching. But their perception was that Jesus is coming for the purpose of creating this revolution And now he's going to be the one who leads them out of this occupation of Rome. He's going to drive Rome out. And now this kingdom of Israel is once again going to be reestablished in a way that they had recognized from the Old Testament particularly, that once again it's going to be this great powerful kingdom. What Jesus is trying to do here is to get them to understand that the kingdom is coming, that the inauguration is about complete. But what he is trying to get them to understand is that it's not going to happen the way you think it's going to happen. And it is something that, again, is so radically different than what they would have understood that they just don't understand it. They have no idea what's going on here, even though he has told them now twice that this is what is going to happen to him. And so he leaves Galilee, and he begins the process then of heading towards Jerusalem. And in fact, what is interesting is that it is recorded particularly in Luke's gospel. Now, Matthew and Mark indicate this, but Luke is the one who comes right out and states, having left Galilee for the final time, he's entered into the region of Judea, and it says that he had his face set to go to Jerusalem. Now, when you hear the expression, your face is set, what does that entail to you? What would that mean? I'm sorry? Okay, he's moving straight forward. And the idea that I want to get across is the fact that here he is determined. It is a determination that he's going to Jerusalem, and he knows what is waiting for him. But nonetheless, he goes on to Jerusalem knowing that this is what is going to happen. Now again, his disciples have no idea what he's talking about, but they would soon come to learn what he was talking about. And so what we are seeing as Jesus leaves Galilee, as he leaves these Gentile regions, and as he enters into the region of Judea with his face set towards Jerusalem, what this points out is that there was nothing that was going to stop Jesus from accomplishing what his goal was. And he knows exactly what is going to happen to him. And so what we're going to try to do here is to just kind of paint a picture. We're not going to be able, obviously, to go into the depth of any of this stuff because, again, that's not really the purpose of this class. Again, it is simply to look at how the four Gospels unpack this story and how it is that they are trying to help us, the readers of it, understand what Jesus' purpose was and how he went about accomplishing this purpose. I would also make this observation that as you see him there in Galilee, and as he has been talking to his disciples about all of this, that Jesus was, how do I want to say this? He was purposely going about creating controversies. And what he is doing is he's developing, there is a tension that begins to develop, particularly between him and the Jewish leaders. Now, everything he does in a revolutionary kind of a way. Everything from his entrance into Jerusalem, his triumphal entry, what is called, the cleansing of the temple, the cursing of a fig tree, all of the things that are happening when people then come and confront him. What this does is it points out that as he has entered into Judea, he recognizes that he is going to get more and more resistance. And so he is confronted with all kinds of controversies, some before he gets into Jerusalem, some after he gets into Jerusalem. And so some of the things that you will find that are recorded particularly by Matthew and Mark is the fact that there are people who came to test him about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And they want to kind of put him in a box, so to speak. And Jesus doesn't fall for it. He goes and he actually teaches what the truth would be on that particular subject, because by this time, the whole concept of marriage, divorce, and remarriage had been so skewed by the way that these Jewish rabbis had taught what was actually recorded over in Deuteronomy, I think it's in the 24th chapter. And Jesus is giving it its proper meaning. So you have that particular controversy. Then there is obviously the controversy of the cleansing of the temple. Once he's in Jerusalem, they question his authority not once, not twice, but 3 times. They will question his authority. Then there is the issue of paying taxes. And again, the whole purpose of this is to try to get him in trouble. These people aren't genuinely interested in the truth. They are interested in putting Jesus in a position that is going to make it so difficult for him that ultimately he is going to say something, at least that's what they're hoping, that is going to get the people to turn against him. And consequently, the plan that they had in order to be able to get rid of him would finally come to fruition. And in fact, you see this like in Matthew chapter 21, there in verse 46, and this is after one of the parables that he spoke. He is in the city of Jerusalem, and it says in verse 46, and although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. So there is this plan, if you will, that is being set forth by these Jewish leaders. How can we get rid of Jesus? But what is also interesting, at least it was to me as I was studying this and kind of put all of this stuff together, Jesus also does a great deal of teaching with respect to the demands of discipleship. In other words, he's trying to help them to understand. He's taught about discipleship already, but it's becoming more and more pronounced. And he's trying to help them to understand what it truly means to be a disciple of Christ. That is, one who would follow after him. And so you see things like he blesses the little children. And what he did is he used this to teach the qualities of those who would be the true ones who would enter into the kingdom of God. These qualities that would be characteristic of a little child. He encounters a rich young ruler. And he emphasizes in this that there is this need to place Jesus first and the will of God first in your life and not allow your material possessions to become something that is so overwhelming that this is what your objective in life is. And that's a lesson that Mark is particularly going to be unpacking that in our series that begins not next Sunday, but the following Sunday. It is on Wednesday. Mark is going to be addressing that. It's a book called Blessed to Bless. And it deals with these ideas of how do we take the material possessions that God has blessed us with, how do we use these things? Well, it begins right here, at least this is part of it, where Jesus is with this young ruler who is very wealthy. And he comes to him and he says, what do I need to do to enter into the kingdom? And Jesus tells him, to do what the law says. He says, I've done all of those things. And Jesus then tells him, sell everything you have. Give it up and come and follow me. Now, I don't believe that he's saying that that is across the board what everybody needs to do. But what he is saying is that we have to be able to understand where our emphasis should be placed. And it's not upon our material possessions. Because all that does is bring us pain and suffering and agony, particularly when we don't have them anymore. And so what Jesus is pointing out is this following me trumps everything. And then there are the parables, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, and these are just some samples that I have in my notes here. The parables of the laborers in the vineyard, which again is something that is unique to Matthew. Mark, Luke, nor John records this. But what you see in this particular parable is that Jesus is emphasizing the equality of all his disciples in a world that is filled with emphasis upon privilege. And so he's trying to point out that anybody can come into this kingdom, not just the rich, not just the people who have been privileged, but particularly it would be the marginalized, the ones who would be looked down upon. These are the ones who also can have access to this. And then there is the request of James and John to sit at Jesus' right and left hands. And what Jesus does is he takes advantage of this situation to emphasize that the greatness of the kingdom of God is not based upon status. It is based upon service. And in fact, that's where you find that very familiar text over in Mark in the 10th chapter, particularly I think it's around verse 35, maybe it's somewhere between 35 and 45, where Jesus comes and says, I think it's verse 45 because it's the very end, where he makes the statement that he did not come to be served, but he came to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So he's pointing to what it is that he's doing. They still don't get it, but what he's trying to help them understand is what true discipleship consists of. Now, there is one incident that I want us to think about for just a few minutes that is unique to John, and that is the raising of Lazarus from the dead that's recorded over in John chapter 11. Okay, so Jesus has just been in the city of Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. And if you're familiar with the way the feasts would work, the Jewish Feast of Dedication would have been in the fall. And now The Passover, which is the next feast, comes in the early spring. And so we're talking about a few months here. And Jesus has just been at the Feast of Dedication. It resulted in massive controversy to the point that they left. And in fact, it says that they withdrew again to the east side of the Jordan River. But then Jesus gets information. And the information is that your best friend has just died, or he's sick. He hasn't died yet. At least that's not the information that Jesus got. But that he is sick. Where does Lazarus live? Remember what city he lives in? It's not really a city, it would have been a town. In Bethany. How far is Bethany from Jerusalem? It's about 2 miles. So it'd be like Kingsport and Colonial Heights, even though Colonial Heights has been subsumed by Kingsport. But that's the distance we're talking about. Okay, now when Jesus makes this statement that he's going to go back to Bethany, do you remember how his disciples reacted to that? Anybody remember what happened there? That's right. They think he's crazy. And they even say, Lord, you were just there. And they tried to kill you, and you're going to go back? And Jesus delays his departure from the east side and waits for 3 days. That's an interesting thing because, this is kind of an aside, but I just thought about this. When you think about some of the miracles that Jesus performed, he had raised other people from the dead by this point. But Lazarus is different because when he raised those other people, like the young girl from the dead, that was immediate. She had died. They had the mourners around and everything like that. He goes in and he raises her from the dead. Lazarus is different. He delays 3 days before he goes back. And he is wanting to make sure that the Jews understand something. Does anybody know what the nature of the 3 days would have been all about that they could share with the class? Why did he delay 3 days? He knows he's sick. He knows he's dying. In fact, he knows he's dead. And yet he waits for 3 days to go back. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Okay, within Jewish understanding, back in those periods of time, they considered that the soul of the individual hung around the body for 3 days. And so it was one of those kind of things where we want these people to know that Lazarus is dead. And so he delays for 3 days because he's making that point. Lazarus is really dead. Now, with the other ones, they could have said, well, she really wasn't dead. In fact, some of them did say that. But the fact is, we know that he raised, like the young lady from the dead and everything. But Lazarus is different because now nobody can question this. He's been in the tomb. He is dead. Dead as he can be. You can't get much deader than Lazarus was. And yet, Jesus now comes back to Bethany. It's a very emotional scene as you see him interacting with Martha and Mary. And Jesus actually raises him from the dead. Now, a lot could be said about this. But for the purposes that I have, I just want us to simply note that when the word of this miracle got back to the Jewish leadership, it's something that they cannot deny. They knew he was dead. And so when it got back to the Jewish leadership, it caused such an uproar that they were now determined that they were going to put Jesus to death. And so you look at this, for instance, in John's gospel, because John is the only one who records this. Over here in John chapter 11, beginning there in verse 45, it says, "Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, 'What are we to do? For this man performs many signs.'" Now, they're not happy about this. As a matter of fact, as you continue to read on through John, they are trying to figure out a way to kill Lazarus, to get rid of him, because he is evidence of the power of Christ. And so they say, "What are we supposed to do?" And he says, "If we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." And that's when Caiaphas chimes in and he says, "Somebody's got to die for the nation." Now, he didn't know what he was saying at the time. In fact, I'm convinced he didn't know what he was saying, period. But whatever the case, he was speaking prophetically and how it would be, because he is the high priest. And he is speaking prophetically about what is about to happen. And that is that Jesus is going to die, and he is going to die for the nation. But their observation is dying for the nation means that it's going to protect them from Rome. Whereas dying for the nation meant that Jesus is actually going to provide freedom to the people from what really has them in bondage. And that's not Rome, it's sin. So this is all playing into what what his purpose is in coming about for the purpose of eventually dying on the cross. And so what happens then is that with this massive notoriety that Jesus has received as a result of this, he departs with his disciples for a short period of time. In John 11, verse 54, he departs to a town called Ephraim. Now, nobody knows really where that is, but they do know, based upon what it said, that it was near the wilderness. And so he has left Bethany, and he has traveled somewhere eastward, perhaps on the other side of the Jordan, although most people believe that it's still on the west side of the Jordan River. But whatever the case, it's in the area that is close to the wilderness. And he is there until it is finally time for the completion of his work. And then what happens is Jesus goes back. He begins the process of making his journey towards Jerusalem. And again, the first place he stops is in Bethany. And it is at that time that Jesus is anointed. Now, Matthew and Mark, interestingly enough, the way that they record this, and by the way, Luke doesn't record this, but Matthew and Mark and John all record this. And Matthew and Mark include this in their narratives, and it's evident that the way they're including it is they do this topically. Because what they do is they locate this between a reference to the plot of the Jewish leaders to arrest Jesus and Judas's arrangement to see to it that Jesus is finally going to be arrested. So that's where they identify it. That's where they place it. And that all happens in the city of Jerusalem. Okay, that is where this arrangement is being made by Judas. But John is the one, and John is the only one who gives us the time as to when this happened. And he says in chapter 12 and verse 1 that it was 6 days before the Passover. So with that in mind, what day do you think this is? It's very close to Jesus' end, but it's 6 days before the Passover. Now, the Passover is on Friday. That is, it would be this Friday going into Saturday morning. That's the way it played out that particular year. That being the case, what day of the week is this? 6 days before. I had to count that too. This would be Saturday. This is what I'm suggesting. That this is Saturday. Jesus is going to go the next day, he's going to enter into Jerusalem. So it's Saturday, he is in Bethany, they perform or they put on this wonderful feast for him, and it is clear, as you see from what John particularly writes, that the circumstances that surround this have a connection to one particular event that Jesus himself identifies. First of all, let me ask this question. When these people, that is, when they all gathered together, what winds up happening? What is the one thing that stands out in this particular incident? It's not like they didn't have festival or feasts or dinners where Jesus would have been their top guest. But this one is a little bit different. What happens at this one? Somebody comes and anoints him. One of the women, it is believed to be Mary, comes and anoints Jesus. Now, how did they react to that anointing? Okay, that she's just being wasteful. I mean, this oil was very, very expensive. And they react in a very negative way, and particularly Judas. He reacts in a very negative way, saying this money could have been used to help the poor. And Jesus gives somewhat of not a lengthy explanation, but he does tie it in with something in particular where he says, let this happen because it's being done for this reason. What's the reason? I'm sorry? His burial. It is because of his burial. Jesus knows, he has not one whim of doubt what is going to happen. And so he knows he's going to die. And so this is being used as a means in his mind to prepare him for the burial that he will eventually experience once he is dead. Okay, so there is that anointing that has taken place. And now we begin the last week of his life. And so he first, as far as the final days of his public ministry is concerned, he first enters into Jerusalem. Okay, now, with Jesus' arrival into the city, all of the gospel writers, all four of them, indicate that the anticipation of his arrival and the conflict that was simmering was just simply growing to a fever pitch. There is a crescendo that is about to occur. And Jesus entering into the city, particularly entering the city the way that he did, is only manifesting this great tension that is going to continue to develop until it finally explodes when Jesus is taken away and he is crucified. Now, the events surrounding his arrival, this is a summation on my part, but I want to suggest to you that when you see his arrival, it's on the first day of the week, it's Sunday morning, when he enters into the city of Jerusalem and his triumphal entry. And what you see then happening over the next few chapters is what transpires on Tuesday, Monday and Tuesday, but particularly Tuesday. Wednesday, I'm not sure what happened, if anything happens. Maybe some of this happened on Wednesday. But for sure, we're looking at the first part of the week. And the first thing that we see in the first part of the week is this triumphal entry that all four of the Gospels write about. Now, how did Jesus enter in to the city of Jerusalem? He was on a donkey. A donkey, now mind you. Okay, and he has this entourage of his disciples following him. Particularly in ancient empires, when a king came in to conquer a city and had conquered it, how did they come in? I'm sorry? On a horse, and generally it was a white horse. They would be riding a white horse, and who would be following them would be all of their soldiers, that they have come in and they have been victorious. What you see here is a parody. Jesus is riding on a donkey, and he is with a bunch of ragtag people who are following him into the city. But what it is it's giving the picture of what would have been a standard welcome of a conquering ruler. The only difference is he's not on a horse and he's not with soldiers. He's on a donkey and he's with these followers who don't really amount to much, particularly in the minds of the Jewish leadership. And so this is how he enters into the city of Jerusalem. And it's significant to note something. And Luke is the only one that mentions this. And sometimes it's hard to figure out just exactly when this happened, but I want to suggest to you it happened when he first comes into the city. Luke mentions this over in the 19th chapter of Luke in verses 41 through 44. I did have a question on the sheet about it for those of you who have answered the questions. And so the question was, as Jesus was about to enter Jerusalem on his triumphal entry, he did something. And asked, what did he do and why did he do it? What does Luke record for us there over in the 19th chapter? He wept. He comes into the city. This is the triumphal entry. And as he enters, he's crying. Why would he be crying? Is he crying because he knows he's going to go to the cross? No, he knows he's going to the cross. I'm sorry, Hazel? He knows what is going to happen to the city of Jerusalem. So what is going to happen to the city of Jerusalem? It's going to be destroyed. And he will mention that, which is recorded in at least three of the Gospels. So the point is that Jesus knows, he sees this great reaction. All of these people are welcoming him and all of this kind of stuff, but he knows what is ultimately going to happen to Jerusalem. And I would suggest not only that, but by extension, he knows what is going to happen to the Jewish people. And that is that there is going to be a massive slaughter, which, if you are familiar with ancient history, particularly Jewish history, that is exactly what happened when the Romans came in and conquered the city of Jerusalem, tore the temple down, burned everything, and killed all of these people and took many of them captive. Jesus knows that this is going to happen. Now again, there's a lot that could be said about the triumphal entry itself, but for our purpose, I think what we should note is that both Matthew and John attach this to the Old Testament prophecies. And who do they attach it with, and what is being said? Okay, it's being attached to Zechariah. In fact, specifically, it's Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And what this is it is a messianic prophecy about the one who would come in, who would be their Messiah, and how that he would enter into the city lowly, riding on a donkey, upon the foal, the colt of a donkey. And what both Matthew and John do is they say that Jesus has fulfilled this. Now, John goes on to say that the people didn't understand what was happening until Jesus had been glorified. So they're not understanding what is happening here, but Matthew and John tie it in with a prophecy about the coming of Christ, or the coming of the Messiah, into their city. And so what this is, again, is a messianic it's a messianic illustration, if you will, that Jesus is declaring by the way he is coming in to these people, I am the Messiah. I am the one who you have been looking for. Now again, they didn't understand the significance of the event perhaps in that kind of detail. I would suggest to you that what they are doing is they're thinking, okay, this guy's finally arrived, he's going to start the revolution. And yet they wouldn't understand the true meaning of this until after his resurrection. Because obviously Jesus did not start what they considered to be a revolution that was going to give them freedom. They just didn't understand the kind of revolution he was bringing. And it's also evident that those who opposed Jesus didn't understand what was happening. And what they did is that they simply recognized this as a threat to their power, hastening their plans to get rid of him. And so as you see here in John, the 12th chapter and verse 19, it says, so the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you are gaining nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Now Jesus has become this enormous threat. He has always been controversial, but now he becomes a threat to them. And so what they have to do is they have to get rid of him. And so now begins the process of doing it. And there is finally a catalyst that occurs that sets this all off. And that is the cleansing of the temple. Now, if you're reading in Matthew and in Mark and Luke, they're the ones who record this cleansing of the temple. What I think is interesting is that Mark is the only one that indicates that once Jesus came in on his triumphal entry, he went to the temple, but then he retired. He left the city, probably went back to the city of Bethany where it's most likely he was staying. So what you see happening then on Sunday is that Jesus goes in with his entourage of people in this very unique sort of a way, giving all kinds of indications as to who he is, particularly with respect to the messianic implications. He goes to the temple, he sees what's going on, and then he leaves. So it would be therefore Monday when he comes back in, as Mark's account particularly indicates this, and he goes on Monday morning. He comes to the temple as he returns to the city of Jerusalem, but as he is traveling there to Jerusalem and before the cleansing of the temple, there is something that happens that you might recall. Anybody have a recollection of what took place that is recorded, particularly in Mark's gospel, but the other ones also indicate this, at least Matthew and Matthew does. Nolan?
He is hungry and finds a fig tree and there's nothing on it and he curses it.
Okay, so he curses a fig tree. Well, now that's kind of crazy, isn't it? I mean, there's this tree, it's leafed out, and that would indicate that it should be producing figs, but it's not. There's no fruit on it, so he curses it. Okay, now he travels into Jerusalem. And he goes through this process of cleansing the temple. And as Mark records this, I think it's interesting because what he does is he sandwiches the cleansing of the temple between the cursing of the fig tree and the meaning of the cursing of the fig tree when he goes in on Tuesday. Because he goes back the next morning, they see that the fig tree's dead. Man, it died quick. In between is the cleansing of the temple. Now, what I want to suggest to you is this. As most people, I think, will read this and they will see the cursing of the fig tree and then the cleansing of the temple is something that they were fruitless. And when you get to the cleansing of the temple, he's upset by what they're doing and he's just clearing things out because he is so mortified by the things that are happening here. But I think by virtue of the fact that it's been sandwiched between two things, Jesus is indicating something else. And that is, he has cursed the fig tree, he goes into Jerusalem, he casts everything and everyone out of the temple, and then they come back the next day and the fig tree's dead. What I believe that you can get from this is that Jesus, by cursing that fig tree and by his cleansing of the temple, he is telling them, Judaism is coming to an end. It is being finished. And it is being finished by him as he comes to do what it is that he would do. And so, a lot more could be said about this. But what we need to note is that there is great theological significance behind the cursing of that fig tree, the cleansing of the temple, and then the tree itself being dead. And that is that Judaism has fulfilled its purpose. It's ready to die. It's ready to go away. And Jesus is the one who's going to see to it that it comes to its completion. Now, a lot more could be said about it, but what we need to note at this point is that this is the final catalyst that spurs those leaders on to plotting the death of Jesus. It's like, okay, we have had enough of this guy. We now need to get rid of him. And Mark makes it clear over in the 11th chapter of Mark, there in the 18th verse. He says, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all of the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So it's Tuesday evening now. Jesus has cleansed the temple, and he has come back after the cleansing of the temple. They've seen this tree dead, and now he comes into the city. He's continuing to teach, and these people that is the leaders, are mortified by all of this. And so what Jesus does when he comes in then on Tuesdays, he continues to teach in the temple. Eventually what winds up happening is that he goes back, this time as he is leaving, they go to the Mount of Olives. There is this, what is probably one of the most complicated and controversial teaching of Jesus that is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke chapter 21. And that is, he is talking about the imminent future of Israel. They've said, Lord, look at how great this temple is. And Jesus says, it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be annihilated. And these are the signs you need to be looking for. And then he goes off and it gets even more enigmatic as he begins to talk about his coming. And so what I would suggest to you as you read through this is to recognize that there are two questions that are being asked. And in these two questions, Jesus first of all speaks about the imminent future of Israel, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem, and then to the future events, and that is that when he returns. And if you get anything out of that, you go to Matthew chapter 25, where he has a number of parables in there, and the point of those parables is to teach people, you need to be vigilant, and you need to be busy about the kingdom of God so that whenever he does come again, however unexpectedly, you will not be taken by surprise, but you will be ready for his return. Okay, so that's what we have now, and we will finish this up next week as we look at what is the climax, and that is his passion, his crucifixion, and finally then his resurrection from the dead. Thank you all for your participation this morning.